December 1944. 30 M4 Shermans of the 743rd Tank Battalion, each mounted with 60 rocket tubes capable of delivering the explosive equivalent of 60 105mm howitzer shells in 30 seconds. Not one rocket was fired. The Ardennes counteroffensive hit, the launchers were unbolted, and the Calliopes went back into storage. 4 months later, before dawn on 4 April 1945, 2 Shermans of the 781st Tank Battalion's headquarters company rolled onto the bluffs above the Neckar River at Heilbronn. 120 rockets crossed the water in under a minute, and the men who crewed those tanks knew that the weapon lighting up the far bank had also made them the most visible targets on the Western Front. The T-34 Calliope, 60 tubes, 30 seconds, and a silhouette that killed the men who carried it. A Sherman's 75mm gun fires 1 round at a time. Against a dug-in German infantry company, entrenched in a tree line, wired into a village cellar, zeroed behind a hedgerow, a tank platoon could hammer that position for hours and never break it open. Allied artillery could solve the problem, but solving it took time. A forward observer had to reach the net. The fire mission had to climb the chain: battery, battalion, clearance, adjustment. 10 minutes from request to shot on a good day, 30 on a bad one. By the time the shells landed, the assault window had closed or the position had shifted. The Soviets had answered this problem with the Katyusha, 16 to 48 rockets on a truck, saturation fire at the regimental level. The Germans had answered it with the Nebelwerfer. Allied troops in Sicily and Italy knew what that answer sounded like. The 15-centimeter Nebelwerfer 41 put 6 rockets into the air in 10 seconds, and the sound that preceded them, a rising, oscillating howl that climbed in pitch until the air itself seemed to tear, earned it 2 nicknames. The British called it Moaning Minnie. The Americans called it Screaming Mimi. The blast pattern shook the ground in clusters. Men who survived Nebelwerfer barrages described the noise before they described the shrapnel, because the noise broke something in you before the steel arrived. The Americans had no equivalent, no mobile, armored, instant saturation weapon a tank platoon leader could call on himself in the assault, without waiting for a fire mission that might never come. In 1943, a U.S. Army Ordnance Department designer named Victor Hawkins proposed an answer: 60 rocket tubes, bolted on top of a Sherman. What could go wrong was about to become the subject of this story. Hawkins took the 4.5-inch M8 rocket developed at Picatinny Arsenal, building on Colonel Leslie Skinner's pre-war work at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and stacked 60 of them in a tubular frame mounted to the turret cheeks of an M4 Sherman. They called it the T-34 Calliope, after the steam organ on Mississippi riverboats, because the parallel pipes looked the part, and the sound they made when fired was close enough to earn the name. 60 tubes, 36 fixed on top, 2 banks of 12 on the bottom. The whole load ripple-fired sequentially in roughly 30 seconds, fast enough that anyone on the receiving end saw not individual rockets, but a continuous wall of fire. Each M8 weighed about 40 pounds and carried a warhead with the explosive yield of a 105mm howitzer shell. 60 of those in half a minute was a volume of fire an entire artillery battery could not match in the same window. Maximum range, 4,100 yards. The launcher yoked mechanically to the 75mm gun barrel, so the turret traversed normally and elevation followed the main gun. But the contract had a price.
In the original mount, the 75mm could not fire with the launcher attached. The tank traded its primary weapon for its rockets. and 1,840 pounds of launcher assembly, bolted a full meter above the turret roof, raised the center of gravity high enough that the Army pulled the Calliope from the D-Day landing plan. The tanks were too unstable for landing craft. The silhouette was impossible to hide. The Calliope was, doctrinally, the American Katyusha. The difference was that the Soviets mass-produced theirs by the thousands and integrated them into doctrine. About 200 Calliope launcher sets were built. The U.S. Army never committed. Glenn Cowboy Lamb, tank commander, 1st Platoon, C Company, 714th Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, commanded one of those 200. His M4A3 was named Coming Home, with Persuader painted on the gun barrel. Lamb knew what the launcher made his tank: a priority target visible from a kilometer. The Germans had learned to read the silhouette. They let standard Sherman columns pass. They waited for the rocket tank. What happened when they found it cost Lamb something he carried for the rest of his life. That story is coming. But first, the weapon had to reach the front. December 1944. 30 Shermans of the 743rd Tank Battalion were fitted with T-34 launchers to support a 30th Infantry Division offensive. The rockets were loaded. The crews were briefed. Then the Ardennes counteroffensive tore through the Allied line, and every available Sherman was needed to plug the gaps. The Calliopes were unbolted without firing a single rocket. 30 launchers. 0 rounds expended. The weapon that could saturate a grid square in half a minute sat in a depot, while the bulge consumed everything around it. It was not until February and March of 1945, launchers reinstalled under Patton's Third Army for the Saarland push, that Calliopes fired in anger for the first time. And then the story the outline of the war had written for this weapon began to play out in full. Spring 1945. Somewhere in southern Germany, Lamb's column was moving forward. The Calliope-equipped Shermans rode at the rear. Always at the rear, because the Germans had figured out the game. Standard Shermans passed. No fire. The column moved unmolested. Then the rocket tank came up, the towering launcher rack visible against the sky like a billboard, and the ambush opened. A German 20mm anti-aircraft autocannon, a weapon designed to kill aircraft at altitude, opened up on the Calliope. The rounds hit the turret. Lamb's account, preserved through his son Joe E. Lamb's donated testimony, records what happened next in 5 words. My friend had his head blown off. That was the contract. 30 seconds of devastating firepower in exchange for becoming the most visible target on the battlefield. A locked-out main gun. An exposed manual reload measured in minutes. A silhouette that announced itself to every German observer within range. Every crew that mounted a Calliope accepted those terms. Some of them paid. Obermodern, Alsace, 15 March 1945. The 14th Armored Division was driving across the Moder River and into the Siegfried Line. A U.S. Signal Corps photographer captured the image that most viewers will recognize without knowing where it was taken. A Calliope-equipped M4A3 in an open field. All 60 tubes firing simultaneously, exhaust trails fanning outward in a ragged arc. The Sherman beneath barely visible through the eruption of smoke and flame. The roar that produced the Calliope nickname. The smoke signature that announced the firing position to every German battery within miles. One correction the record demands. The widely reproduced caption identifies the tank as belonging to the 40th Tank Battalion, 14th Armored Division. The 40th Tank Battalion belonged to the 7th Armored Division. The 14th Organic Tank Battalions were the 25th, 47th, and 48th. Then came Heilbronn. Before dawn, 4 April 1945, west bank of the Neckar River.
Headquarters Company, 781st Tank Battalion, attached to the 100th Infantry Division, 7th Army. Lieutenant Colonel Harry L. Kinney, Jr., commanding. 2 M4A3 Shermans, rigged with T-34 Calliopes, moved onto the high ground overlooking the river. Below, infantry of the 397th and 398th Regiments prepared to assault cross into German-held Heilbronn, a city the Wehrmacht intended to hold. The Calliopes fired. 120 rockets, 60 per tank, ripple-fired across the Neckar into the German strongpoints lining the far bank. The battalion's own published history, Up from Marseille, recorded the moment beneath a photograph with a 3-word caption: 60 rounds in 30 seconds. In pre-dawn darkness, the sequential fire was visible as a rolling wall of flame reflected off the river surface, the screaming howl echoing across the water, the impacts walking through buildings on the opposite shore. This was the Calliope's ideal geometry: elevated firing position, area target across a natural obstacle, infantry needing suppression before a contested crossing. The M8 rocket's worst flaw, its notorious inaccuracy, became irrelevant when the target was an entire urban shoreline. The weapon that could not hit a specific bunker could drown a city block in high explosive. Heilbronn was a 9-day battle. The 100th Division lost 85 men killed and roughly 3 times that number wounded. C Company, 781st Tank Battalion, received a Distinguished Unit Citation for the action. Here is what the audience deserves to hear plainly. No public domain German prisoner interrogation report, war diary entry, or veteran memoir specifically describes a Calliope salvo by name. The popular claim that the noise alone caused mass surrenders cannot be traced to a sourced German account. The closest direct enemy reaction comes from the British Sherman Tulip, Shermans fitted with RP-3 air-to-ground rockets by the Coldstream Guards, near Lingen, Germany, April 1945. A captured German officer protested to his British captors that tank-launched rockets were against the Geneva Convention and not allowed. That is sourced evidence of the shock. It is not evidence specific to the Calliope. The honest gap in the record is the record. The M8 rocket itself did not survive the war. Officially classified as a barrage weapon, its folding fins, optimized for air launch, were unreliable at low ground launch angles. The Army replaced it with the spin-stabilized M16 specifically because of accuracy problems and retired the M8 before VE Day. And the Calliope's reload, tubes loaded by hand from outside the hull, crew exposed for minutes with no return fire, made the weapon a one-shot system. 30 seconds of saturation, then nothing. The doctrinal idea survived. Mobile, armored, rocket saturation called in by the maneuver commander. That concept lives today in the M270 MLRS and the HIMARS, the descendants of a thought that Victor Hawkins bolted onto a Sherman turret in 1943. 2 Shermans on a bluff above the Neckar, 60 tubes apiece. The howl of 120 rockets crossing a river in the dark, and then the silence that followed. The silence under which the infantry of the 100th Division climbed into their boats and crossed into Heilbronn. The Calliope is gone. About 200 were built. The sound is what survived. In the accounts, in the unit histories, in the words of the men who heard it. The men who crossed the river remember the silence after. That was when the dying started.